Before Peter Beardsley, before Paul Gascoigne, before Newcastle's modern heroes, there was Tony Green, a player some older supporters still describe as one of the most gifted talents they ever saw. Not because of what he achieved, but because of what he was about to become. When Tony Green arrived at Newcastle United, excitement quickly spread around St James's Park. He was clever, fearless, and blessed with the kind of talent that could change a match in a single moment. Fans believed they were watching the future, a future filled with great days, great memories, and perhaps even greatness itself. But football can be cruel. Sometimes a career is measured in trophies, sometimes it is measured in moments, and sometimes it is measured by what was taken away. Tony Green's story belongs in that last category, because just as his dream was beginning to come true, everything started to unravel. At only 25 years old, he would face the most heartbreaking moment of his life, a moment that would change his future forever. And decades later, people are still asking the same question. What if Tony Green had been given more time? Before we uncover the heartbreaking truth behind his lost dream, subscribe for more football legends and forgotten heroes. Every football legend starts somewhere. For Tony Green, it started far away from the noise of St James's Park, far away from the admiration of Newcastle supporters, and far away from the cruel moment that would eventually change his life forever. He was born in Glasgow, Scotland, a city that had already produced countless footballers. But even as a young boy, Tony possessed something special. A natural confidence with the ball, an imagination that could unlock defences, and a determination to make his dream a reality. Unlike many young players of his generation, Tony refused to rely on football alone. Education mattered to him, the classroom mattered to him, and years later, that decision would prove more important than he could ever have imagined. His football journey began with Albion Rovers. It was there that his reputation started to grow. Week after week, supporters watched a young midfielder capable of doing things others simply couldn't. He could create, he could dribble, he could see passes before anyone else, and most importantly, he could excite a crowd. It didn't take long for bigger clubs to take notice. The talent was impossible to ignore. Tony Green was heading for a bigger stage, a bigger challenge, and a future that seemed full of endless possibilities. At the time, everything appeared to be going exactly as planned. The dream was alive, and the best years of his career still seemed to be ahead of him. It did not take long for Tony Green to outgrow Albion Rovers. His talent was obvious. Bigger clubs were watching, and eventually Blackpool made their move. For Tony, it was the chance he had been waiting for. A bigger stage, a bigger challenge, and a chance to prove he belonged in English football. He quickly became a fan favourite. Supporters loved his skill, his creativity, and his ability to make defenders look helpless. The more he played, the more people started talking about him. Then came the performance that changed everything. In the FA Cup, Tony scored twice in a famous 4-0 victory over West Ham United. One goal came from a brilliant run, the other from outside the box. It was the kind of display that demanded attention. Suddenly, Tony Green was no longer a promising player. He was becoming one of football's most exciting talents. Scouts continued to watch. The interest continued to grow. And before long, a much bigger opportunity arrived. Newcastle United wanted Tony Green, and his life was about to change forever. By 1971, Tony Green was no longer a hidden talent. People knew he was special. The question was who would take the chance on him. The answer was Newcastle United. Manager Joe Harvey was convinced he had found something rare. So convinced that Newcastle paid around £150 to bring Tony to St James's Park. At the time, it was a significant investment, and Newcastle desperately needed it to work. The club was struggling, confidence was low, supporters were frustrated, and Newcastle were drifting dangerously close to trouble. Then Tony Green arrived. Almost immediately, things began to change. He brought imagination, energy, and a level of creativity the team had been missing. Fans noticed it straight away. Every touch seemed to lift the crowd. Every run created excitement. Every match increased the feeling that Newcastle had discovered something special. Joe Harvey certainly believed it. Years later, he would describe Tony as the finest signing he ever made. And for a brief period, it looked as though Newcastle had found the player who could lead them into a brighter future. Some older supporters would later compare him to Peter Beardsley. Others believed he was even better. Not because of statistics, but because of the feeling he created whenever he stepped onto the pitch. Then came the day that convinced the rest of the country. A trip to Old Trafford, a meeting with Manchester United, and the performance that many Newcastle fans would never forget. By 1972, Newcastle supporters already knew what Tony Green could do. Now it was time for the rest of the country to find out. The opportunity came at Old Trafford, Manchester United, one of the biggest stadiums in football, and a team filled with star names. Most importantly, George Best. For many players, Old Trafford was a place to survive. For Tony Green, it became a stage, and he embraced it. From the opening whistle, he was everywhere, demanding the ball, driving Newcastle forward, creating problems Manchester United struggled to solve. Then came the moment supporters still talk about today. Tony collected the ball deep inside his own half. He surged forward, leaving opponents behind, including George Best. The crowd could hardly believe what they were seeing. Before long, Newcastle were in control. Tony helped create both goals in a famous 2-0 victory. It was one of the finest performances of his career, and one of the most memorable Newcastle performances of that era. Suddenly, the excitement surrounding Tony Green no longer belonged only to Newcastle supporters. The football world was beginning to take notice. Joe Harvey felt vindicated, the fans felt hopeful, and Tony himself seemed to be getting better with every game. At just 25 years old, the future looked limitless. Newcastle believed they had found a player capable of becoming one of the very best. Nobody inside Old Trafford that afternoon could have imagined what would happen next. Because only weeks later, everything would change forever. Football can be cruel. Sometimes it takes years for a dream to fall apart. Sometimes it happens in a single moment. For Tony Green, that moment arrived on September 2, 1972. Newcastle were facing Crystal Palace. The season was still young. The future still looked bright. Tony was only 25 years old, and he was playing some of the best football of his life. Then disaster struck. A challenge, a damaged knee, and suddenly one of Newcastle's brightest stars was on the ground. At first, few realised how serious it was. Players get injured all the time. Most come back. Most continue their careers. But this injury was different. The damage was severe, and the road back became far more difficult than anyone expected. To his credit, Tony never blamed Crystal Palace defender Mel Blythe. Years later, he made it clear that he believed the challenge was accidental. There was no bitterness, no public anger, only disappointment and hope. Hope that somehow he could return to the player he had been. But as the weeks passed, that hope slowly began to fade. The treatment available in the early 1970s was nothing like modern football. The recovery dragged on, the setbacks continued, and the reality became harder to ignore. The player who had lit up St James's Park, the player many believed could become Newcastle's next great superstar, was fighting a battle he could not win. And the worst part was yet to come. For months, Tony Green refused to give up. He worked, he waited, and he hoped. Like any footballer, he believed he would return. He believed the nightmare would eventually end. But deep down, reality was beginning to catch up with him. The knee never responded the way he wanted. The sharpness was gone, the freedom was gone, and with every setback, the dream drifted further away. Eventually, the truth became impossible to escape. Tony Green would never be the same player again. Years later, he finally opened up about that painful period. He admitted that modern footballers would likely have received very different treatment. Modern surgery, modern rehabilitation, modern recovery methods, perhaps even a second chance. But Tony belonged to a different era, an era when careers could disappear much faster. Looking back, he never filled his interviews with anger. Instead, there was something far sadder: acceptance. Tony admitted he would have loved to continue playing, but he also knew there was no changing the past. Because no matter how much talent a player possesses, some battles cannot be won. For Newcastle supporters, the feeling was heartbreaking. They had watched a special talent emerge, then watched him disappear almost as quickly. Joe Harvey felt the loss deeply. In fact, he later described Tony Green's retirement as one of the saddest moments he had experienced in football. The dream was over, the career was over, and at just 25 years old, one of football's greatest what-if stories had already been written. But Tony Green's life was far from over. In many ways, a completely different chapter was only just beginning. For many players, an early retirement can be devastating, especially when it comes without warning. Tony Green had every reason to feel bitter, every reason to look back with regret. But he chose a different path. Even during his playing days, education mattered to him. He knew football would not last forever, and when the game was taken away, that decision proved priceless. Instead of dwelling on the past, Tony focused on building a future. He became a mathematics teacher, a world away from packed stadiums and roaring crowds. But it gave him purpose, and it gave him stability. He later joined the famous pools panel, a role he would hold for decades. While some former players struggled to adapt, Tony quietly built a respected life beyond football. Away from the spotlight, away from the headlines, he settled in the Blackpool area with his wife, Christine. And although his football career ended far sooner than anyone expected, his story did not, because Newcastle supporters never measured Tony Green by trophies or by statistics. They measured him by the memories he left behind, the excitement, the hope, and the feeling that they had witnessed something truly special. A talent that arrived, shined brightly, and disappeared far too soon. More than 50 years have passed since Tony Green last wore a Newcastle United shirt. Yet his name refuses to disappear. Not because of trophies, not because of records, and not because of a long career at the top. Tony Green is remembered because of the impression he left behind. In only a short period, he convinced supporters they were watching a truly exceptional footballer. Even today, older Newcastle fans still speak about him with admiration. Some compare him to Peter Beardsley. Others simply call him one of the finest players they ever saw. That alone tells you everything. Most footballers are remembered for what they achieved. Tony Green is remembered for the excitement he created, the belief he inspired, and the promise he carried. Tony Green's career may have ended too soon, but his legacy never did, because football supporters have a special place in their hearts for players who made them dream, and few players gave Newcastle fans more reason to dream than Tony Green. His time at the club was brief. His career was cruelly interrupted, but his place in Newcastle folklore remains secure. The dream may have ended at 25. The memories never did. If you enjoyed this story of one of football's forgotten talents, subscribe for more football legends and untold stories.